Okay, just to kind of extend the conversation we just had, we're going to have a broader conversation on food systems and WASH. So as we all know, water is the lifeblood of agriculture, and sanitation and hygiene is so crucial to ensure that the food that populations eat is safe. So we're going to have a panel of experts that will discuss kind of the best practices and challenges ensuring sustainable water and sustainable sanitation services. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Erin Sunsmo, who is Associate Vice President of Agriculture, Resilience, and Water at Winrock International. And then I'd also like to welcome Ahmad Shuka, who is Program Manager for Livelihood and Environmental Actions for Development at Mercy Corps. And if Dr. Inga Jacobs-Mata could please come to the stage. She is the Regional Representative for Southern Africa at the International Water Management Institute. Welcome. And finally, Aparna Srivastava, who is Deputy Chief Climate Officer at the United States International Development Finance Corporation. Okay, she'll be joining us. So thank you all for joining us for this conversation. So Dr. Inga, I'd like to start with you, please. Southern Africa is one of the regions of the world that's experiencing drying and extreme weather as climate change progresses. Can you talk a bit about how this is impacting food systems?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. It's great to be in New York. Yeah, Eastern Southern Africa, I think the previous speaker also put it well. It's a climate hotspot. Growing severity of floods and droughts, increasing frequency of floods and droughts. But the way I like to put it, it's also a research for development hotspot. So you have lots of research, development organizations, local partners, research organizations that have been there for, decades doing really good work. So there's no sort of shortage of innovation. It's just about how we are scaling this in a coordinated and in an inclusive manner. But what we see is these climate impacts. We feel the impact, of course, in livelihoods, on farms, but right through value chains to businesses, especially agri-businesses, and so really helping. How do we support small businesses like agri-businesses to really become resilient? Is quite key. So we see, multiple impacts from the farm to the fork.
And Erin, your work at Winrock involves working with smallholder farmers and communities. Can you explain to us what Winrock is, and what are some of the more effective strategies you've discovered in your work to ensure adequate water for food production?
Sure. Thanks so much, Sarah. And it's a pleasure to be up here with Dr. Inga, continuing also the conversation with Michael, thinking about East and Southern Africa forefront as well, and commenting. I've just relocated back to the U.S. after 4 years in Zimbabwe, and trying to build resilience and sustainable access to water for agricultural communities in dryland areas. Seeing the impacts of the drought on those communities affects every aspect of life, from, of course, the agricultural production, livestock, even energy production in the country with so much hydropower driven by water, the tasks of household duties that now take so much longer to fetch water for cooking, for cleaning. It really dominates life in rural areas, and such we need systemic solutions. And so one of the ways that we've tried to tackle this is really taking a systemic bottom-up approach to sustainable access to agricultural, to water needs, which is consulting with communities initially, understanding the different water usages, and not just of the farmer, understanding our women and girls, understanding the different uses from livestock to household use to energy and commercial consumption. We need holistic solutions. And so working with water user associations, working with municipal governments to put policies in place that identify and address the needs of those diverse populations. And of course, as we know, having policies isn't enough. How do we enforce, implement? How do we monitor whether those are happening and those user fees that are generated? And so a lot of the work at Winrock that is done in this space is strengthening those water resource management structures. At the same time, we have to be more efficient with what we're using the water for. So as we're choosing the crops that we're growing, in Zimbabwe, one of the things we're working on is demazing in dry land areas because the water wasn't there to be able to sustainably have a harvest of maize year in and year out. And so moving towards sorghum and maize as an example, but that requires systemic changes throughout the value chain as well. And so how do we take those different approaches, increasing our efficiency of our water technology and storage, as well as incorporating the other needs and usages. So it really takes that systemic response for that.
Okay, thank you. And welcome, Aparna. Ahmed, if you could turn to kind of this conversation around ecological solutions. I know at the UN this week, that's a big part of the conversation is restoring and maintaining kind of the natural systems that serve us all.
Yes, for sure. I mean, the ecological integrity of our water resources is essential to protect the human health and to maintain biodiversity. Unfortunately, there are many factors that are threatening the integrity of our water resources, including climate change, pollution, overuse and depletion, and habitat destruction. So to be honest, what we need to do is we need to focus on neutralizing these risks or these threats. That's the first thing that we should do, Sarah. And this can be done by, first of all, showing more commitment in our fight against the climate change. We need to work more on climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. And we need to make our communities more climate resilient. That's the first thing. We need also to protect our water sources. This is very important, to protect our water sources and to reduce pollution. This also can be done by implementing best management practices in industry and agriculture. So we can reduce the use of chemicals and the overuse of fertilizers. 3, we need also to promote sustainable water use, starting from water conservation to wastewater reuse. Of course, we can do nothing out of these unless we have strict and clear regulations and policies that are respected and enforced. It's very important to enforce these regulations and policies because we have a lot of regulations, a lot of policies worldwide that are not enforced, unfortunately.
Thank you. Aparna, so from the climate finance perspective, what's the investment case for mitigation, which might include kind of funding for solar and wind, as opposed to adaptation, which could include projects that focus on WASH? Why would you say WASH investments are a tougher sell?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you so much for having me. Just in terms of background, I'm the Deputy Chief Climate Officer at the DFC. We're the U.S. government's development finance institution with a mandate to partner with the private sector to address the most pressing development challenges. I think it's a really key driver, I think, in why we see the disparities when it comes to climate finance between mitigation and adaptation. The ability to monetize benefits on the mitigation side of things, whether it's for clean energy to be able to sell that power, or even on energy efficiency in terms of reducing unit costs. The same thing when it comes to adaptation is much more difficult to quantify, as we all know, and especially on the water side. I think for us as DFC, it's an area that we've really struggled to find, a pipeline of bankable opportunities, because it is a public good and is treated as such, and especially when there's kind of financing that's coming in from the public sector, we are mandated to only partner with private sector entities. And so I think there's kind of a range of barriers there, but I think more broadly, a lot of the barriers that we see in, keeping adaptation financing from really happening at scale and flowing at the scale that we really need to see. It's one and the same when it comes to the WASH space as well.
Okay, got it. And Dr. Inga, so a lot of the work that you do focuses on water governance and kind of particularly community-based water governance. Can you talk about the ongoing efforts to recognize the way that people traditionally manage water and turn that into statutory law, water law?
Yeah, thanks. So maybe, I forgot to mention, I work for the International Water Management Institute. We're a research for development organization, part of the CGIAR, which is the world's largest agricultural research partnership. So a lot of the work that we do is very much, as you said, in communities, community-based approaches to water management. And in terms of your question, typically in the regions where I come from, so East and Southern Africa, the way water services delivery is usually managed is through big contractors, so huge contracting companies. They come into a rural community. Very little consultation with the community is done, and they will install whatever reticulation system or whatever infrastructure is needed. And the trouble with that is that most of the time communities don't feel a sense of ownership towards it. There's no buy-in, and ultimately they end up vandalizing these boreholes or systems. And what we have been working to do with many partners in the region is to look at how do you turn that around? How do you make put communities first at the center of infrastructure development? How do you work with them for them to identify what the needs are, to sort of finance it or co-finance it themselves, and to maintain that infrastructure? And we find that approach, it's a bit longer, but it is more sustainable, it's cheaper, and ultimately communities they feel that sense of ownership. So that's the first thing. And also the way in which water then is managed, it's multiple use, right? Whereas big contracting companies typically design infrastructure for single use. So that's the first challenge. Then the second issue is then how do you then scale, how do you incentivize this kind of community-based approach, right? It's not good enough just to have a few projects that are, successful in a few communities. What we have to do is we actually have to institutionalize this into local government planning, and that's the difficult thing. So one way in which we do that is we're trying to advocate for including these kind of community-based approaches into statutory water law. So acknowledging these kind of customary ways, more traditional ways of managing water and getting it recognized into water law. And so we call that sort of hybrid water law. And maybe just one thing to end off on that is it also, I guess, stems from the way in which our legal systems have been set up, which is largely through permits or water use licensing. And what we find is that it often criminalizes the most vulnerable, like smallholder farmers, because they can't afford to pay these licenses, permits. I mean, the most seasoned water professional has trouble navigating the bureaucracy of applying for these licenses. And then the state can't enforce when those licenses are not paid. So it's creating these huge backlogs of water licenses that are not paid and no one can enforce it. And what we're trying to say is, well, because water is managed sort of in this multiple use paradigm in any case, we should really try to expand those parameters, still keep permits and licensing for big strategic uses like industrial uses, but then have a more kind of relaxed or more flexible arrangement for smallholder farmers that acknowledges this kind of customary way of managing water.
And what are the challenges in the process of kind of moving it into law, kind of this traditional to law?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the one is just that first getting policymakers to recognize that, you know, this is a thing, this is the way actually water is managed in communities. So it's a whole change of mindset around how we set up, how we design policy and regulation. The second thing is also, how do you transfer an asset that belongs to a community and now say we have to manage it with the municipality, with government, right? That is quite difficult. How do you get a municipality to recognize that they can actually now contract a community as an infrastructure development organization, as a water service provider? That is a fundamental change. And then how do you get government to recognize that we're not talking about this is not anti-potable water. This is not, you know, trying to do government's job for them, but we're saying in areas where it is difficult to find potable water, communities are finding water for themselves. Let's recognize that, and let's get that better acknowledged into law.
And turning to you, Erin, what is the role that agriculture enterprises play in kind of ensuring that water sources are sustainable?
I think that's a great question, and also follows on that governance and public sector side. What is the role of the private sector in being able to now scale these technologies so that they can be integrated into the communities that we're working with? And so as WinRock, which is an American-based NGO, as we take a market systems development angle and work through the private sector to be able to try to scale these sort of climate smart technologies to increase agricultural production, working with those commercializable practices, whether we're talking about drip kits or solar pumps or what have you, looking for those opportunities to work with the private sector to get their technologies into the hands of people who need them, understanding the barriers and understanding the population. So strengthening the private sector to better target the needs, better understand the willingness to pay, and have a profit incentive to scale some of those technologies. Additionally, some of the work that we do with the private sector is trying to encourage them to bundle services like good agricultural practices, provision of market price, climate price, weather information as a way to build that rapport and client base in the communities that they're serving, so that it both strengthens their business model and that trust as an informational resource, but also strengthens their bottom line. Additionally, maintenance providers of those systems. We've seen the irrigation systems that, as we've talked about, the boreholes or the irrigation systems that have been vandalized and underutilized. How do we build the infrastructure of businesses to maintain and profitably maintain some of those water systems? And then finally, bringing in finance is such a critical component of many of the small scale or medium scale farmers. We need access to finance to be able to cover the cost of these technologies. And so what are financial products that are right-sized for those different populations? And so working with the financial side. The last piece I'll mention, and I'm excited about some of the work we're doing in payment for environmental services, PFES by short, which is being able to collect user rights from companies like water utilities, beverage companies that can pay into a fund for the community that's managing their natural resources in and around a given watershed. And so one example in Vietnam that's been now implemented over the last 10 years has collected over $400 million US that's been directly paid to communities with over 5 million beneficiaries in Vietnam. And those are cash payments made digitally through their phone or through provision of services to those populations. And this is moving away from that donor-driven, USAID-driven model to what would be sustainable without that. funding. And so with government support, with donor support to get these systems off the ground, we're partnering with the private sector and now building on similar systems in other regions of the world, Pacific Islands and Solomon Islands. We're starting out in Malawi, El Salvador. And so I think these models can work in different regions. It's still early days of figuring out what this looks like in almost a post-donor world, if you will, but bringing in some of the voluntary carbon credit and climate finance money into these equations and putting cash into the hands of communities directly for payment for those natural resource management, I think has tremendous potential.
Ahmad, just to follow up on the previous points we were discussing on kind of natural resources and maintenance and restoration of ecological systems. So Mercy Corps works in crisis situations often, and I think in crisis there's a lot of issues around priorities, and I imagine kind of working to ensure that ecological systems are maintained during crisis is a hard sell. Kind of what sort of conversations, what sort of strategies does Mercy Corps use to kind of ensure that nature-based solutions are part of humanitarian responses?
Yeah, like unfortunately, many countries and many people think that water resources management and ecosystem protection are not priorities in crisis situation. However, it's completely the opposite. Specifically and particularly in a crisis situation, the importance of water resources management and ecosystem protection magnifies and becomes more important, as it can directly impact our ability to respond effectively to the crisis. And we can make a lot of arguments here. First of all, in crisis situation, access to safe drinking water becomes more critical, and the risk of water-borne diseases increases. We've seen this in Yemen, we've seen this in Syria because of the wars. So ecosystem protection and the proper water resources management can ensure that our water sources are protected, treated, and distributed safely to those in need, and thereby reducing the risk of waterborne diseases. In addition to that, the importance of water resources management and even ecosystem protection does not only serve in mitigating crises. These things can even prevent some crises, some natural crises like floods and droughts. For example, if we are protecting our ecosystems, if we have proper stormwater management plans and proper water infrastructure, we will be seeing less droughts and less floods in the coming in the future. Another important thing is that ecosystem protection and water resources management, if we're doing that properly, can also prevent some kind of water-related conflicts. And we've seen this in Jordan, because in crisis time, access to water can become a source of conflict. Amid the Syrian refugee crisis in Jordan in 2012 and 2013, water was the main source of conflict between Syrian refugees and Jordanians in the hosting community. So Mercy Corps implemented a lot of projects to ensure that water is distributed equally, and there's equity in distributing water, and make sure that all stakeholders come together and start a dialogue and talk together. So this will reduce the tension and prevent future conflicts.
Aparna, DFC is working to map out small and medium enterprise that are working on water security. Why is DFC doing that, and kind of what are the next steps?
Yeah, thanks. This is something I'm really excited to talk more about. And so just in terms of a little bit of context, fiscal year 22, last year was the biggest year in terms of commitments our agency has made globally. And including for climate, it's the largest number that we've committed, and it was $2.2 billion in climate-linked investments across a wide range of sectors. Now, historically, when we've talked about climate finance, especially in the DFI community, that's really been synonymous to renewable investments, right, on the mitigation side. But what we've been really committed to is figuring out how we can really expand that kind of that definition to really recognize the wide-ranging impacts of climate and therefore the wide-ranging opportunities. And so kind of given this backdrop of the 2.2 billion in climate-linked investments, the adaptation side of investments was really a smaller chunk. So it was not tiny, but it was $390 million, but still not exactly that 50-50 split that we like to see, or that we hope to see as a wider financing community. So given that backdrop, basically at COP27, we launched a concentrated push to accelerate climate-related financing specifically for adaptation. And through that, what we've really identified is that SMEs, so small and medium enterprises, are really, along with being the lifeblood of most economies at, kind of at a local scale, especially on the adaptation side, when solutions really have to be locally driven and locally led, these businesses are really kind of a really key focus area that we want to be really intentional about how we're kind of figuring out deploying our own support for. And so this window that we've launched is inviting applications from businesses globally, but with a target on 4 priority sectors, including agriculture and food security, water security, nature-based solutions, and health. And the kind of those are by no means kind of exclusive, but really kind of the beginning categories that we have really identified. And water is specifically one of those areas, whether it's really on kind of water access or also the sanitation and hygiene side of things, where we've really recognized that SMEs are critical to being able to reach kind of especially the most vulnerable. When we talk about how adaptation financing is not reaching kind of at the community level where it's really needed in terms of flows, this is a window that we've been really excited to establish. So when you can learn more about that on dfc.gov/climate, it's the very first link at the top. But basically through that process, we've established a concentrated effort across various business lines within DFC, including our debt shop, technical assistance, funds, and equity, specifically to look at opportunities in adaptation and especially in the water security space. So please do either find me after or check out that link.
Awesome. And Dr. Inga, just kind of to touch on something you said in your opening remarks, you mentioned kind of this development foundation in Southern Africa, and there's been a lot of innovation that has come out of that. What are some of the innovations that you're most excited about in terms of WASH?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's many, but I think what is exciting, and maybe it's also linked to Aparna's point around sort of how we support the glue that links the farmer to the market, right? It's the SMEs. It's in the bundling. I think, Erin, you also mentioned it, sort of bundling of innovations and bundling of partners. So what we are seeing now is, partnerships that link solar irrigation with microfinancing and a digital platform that enables, a farmer to both get access to, say, climate information through a digital platform, see all the different pumps provided, but also if they can't afford it, access a microfinance product. So sort of bundling in that way. Others is also a lot being done now around drought-tolerant seeds, seed varieties, but then also looking at sort of how do we also make sure that we couple that with agronomic practices, integrated cropping, right? So it's not just about sort of maize-based systems that we are encouraging, but more diversified agriculture, livestock, legume, aquaculture, agriculture, these types of systems. So I would say, it's not a single innovation. It's really about these kind of bundling for really more sustainable solutions.
And Erin, to just follow up on your previous response as well. So you talked about kind of making sure there's the right type of finance for these projects, and then also the profit incentive. Can you expand upon that and kind of how do you make the right conditions?
Sure. You know, I think it's, and first of all, I want to say I feel like I'm on the right panel. I've agreed with everything that I feel like we should start an organization and continue to merge all of these ideas because they're so interconnected, of bringing together the finance with the policy, with the disaster humanitarian context. But on the profit side, you know, looking at where we can bring some of those innovative technologies specifically that are commercializable and understand where that's going to have significant impact. And so we go through a number of different analyses from our side, and we have our business experts work with the businesses on the technology to understand what the affordability looks like, what is the financing side, what is the impact on the natural environment in terms of the soil, land, and water management, and run that through a lens to select some of the innovations and the companies that are aligned with the same values that we would have as an organization. And those are the companies that we would try to strengthen and promote that business model to help try to encourage them to reach more geographies, reach more demographics, and something that they'll continue carrying on. What we've seen in some of the development programming on the market system side is there are for-profit companies that even create arms of services that they will provide if a donor funds it. But it's really not part of their core business. And so doing that initial vetting, getting an understanding of the motivations from that private sector partner, and of really aligning those values so that we can achieve those joint objectives, and that will continue on at the end of the project. It's a lot easier said than done, but that's a little bit how we do it.
And now I'm wondering if we can just go through all of the speakers and kind of give last thoughts, any points that you wanted to touch on or kind of key takeaways, and we'll start with Aparna.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to I think climate finance generally, but also climate action, anything in the WASH space, I think really to address these gaps, we need all hands on deck. We all have a part to play, whether it's on the financing side, policy, you know, disaster risk reduction. There's so many pieces to the pie here, and so I think just seeing the diverse crew of people that you all have brought together is really inspiring. So hopefully we can all kind of keep this up.
Great. Dr. Inga?
Yeah, maybe building on that, I think for us it's about sort of, you know, just encouraging the whole system approach. So this agri-food system approach, for us, of course, it's about how do we diversify our systems, right? And also build a kind of a food sovereignty in the region through you know, supporting agri businesses, agri SMEs. But I think a lot of, Erin, you spoke about it, it's, you know, despite the fact that there's all this funding, it doesn't get to the SMEs. Many of them are not investment ready or investable yet. So it's sort of how do you work with them, providing that technical support, from climate smart agriculture to gender and social inclusive business models, a whole suite, you know, to help them get to that point where they can access that kind of funding. That's the gap at the moment. Yeah.
So what I wanted to say that particularly in those countries facing fragility and conflicts, it's particularly hard and challenging to achieve water security and food security. So what we need to do is we need to follow an approach that couples both immediate life-saving provision of basic water supplies with longer-term planning that promotes and prioritizes sustainability and resilience in the face of different shocks and crises, specifically those caused by climate change currently.
I would just end by saying we try to focus our responses on our climate smart food systems approach, which is bringing together all of the different players. We certainly by ourselves can achieve quite little, but linking hands with people in the room, people on the stage, we can really achieve tremendous impact. So would just encourage anyone to speak afterwards who may be interested in talking more and exploring partnerships to develop solutions in the different contexts that you work in.
Wonderful. Well, we're unfortunately out of time, but thank you all so much for the rich discussion.
Thank you.